So with the toast between the American President Donald Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping, the first day of this high-stakes meeting in Beijing came to a close. The summit marked an effort by Washington and Beijing to try and steady a relationship that, remember, has been strained for years and could remain strained for many years to come. It was pretty evident at the state banquet that concluded some hours ago. At the state banquet, Xi asserted China and the United States should become partners and not rivals, while Trump described the meeting with Xi Jinping as an honor like few that he had ever seen before. One of the clearest outcomes of the summit was the reset in the strained ties. The tone of the summit also reflected a shared interest in preventing tensions from escalating further.
Today I had an in-depth exchange of views with President Trump on China-U.S. relations, as well as the international and regional situation. We agreed that China-U.S. relations are the most important bilateral relationship in the world today. They can only be handled well and must not be messed up. When the two countries cooperate, both benefit. When they fight, both suffer.
The talks also extended beyond bilateral concerns. In a statement released by the White House, it said that the United States and China have agreed that Iran must never be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. The two leaders also underscored the importance of keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, highlighting concerns about global energy security. Now, another key takeaway were issues related with trade and tariffs. During the talks, both governments pointed to visible progress on tariffs and supply chain tensions. One of the most closely watched issues was China's recent restriction on rare earth exports. Now, Trump said that he had directly discussed the issue with Xi Jinping and claimed that China will continue supplying rare earths under a one-year agreement that could be renewed later. In return, China will get some relief on U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. Now, the summit also appeared to produce some movement on tariffs linked to fentanyl concerns. The U.S. had earlier imposed a 20% tariff on Chinese products in an effort to pressure Beijing. Now, Trump also announced that the tariffs will immediately be reduced to 10% following the talks. Now, China's Commerce Minister later said that Beijing would adjust its own countermeasures accordingly. Now, beyond economics, the summit covered broader cooperation across agriculture, tourism and military communication channels. Discussions included expanding American access to Chinese markets and also encouraging greater Chinese investments into U.S. sectors. Trump also pressed Beijing to increase the purchase of American agricultural goods and strengthen efforts to curb fentanyl flows into the United States.
Together we have the chance to draw on these values to create a future of greater prosperity, cooperation, and happiness, and peace for our children. We love our children. This region and the world is a special world with the two of us united and together.
Now, by the end of the first day, both governments are portraying the summit as productive and also constructive. Trump described the talks as extremely positive and has extended an invitation to Xi Jinping to visit the White House in September. Now, whether the friendly tone and also the preliminary agreements translate into any lasting policy changes is something that has to be seen. All right, now joining us on the broadcast, we've got our correspondent Susan Tehrani, who's joining us live from New York. Susan, this has been a high-stakes state banquet meeting and a lot of issues were discussed and Iran was also discussed. You know, the fact that Donald Trump started the Iran war along with the Israelis hoping that he'd have a quick victory, that has not turned out to be the case. And when he spoke with Xi Jinping, the two leaders apparently agreed that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. The fact that the Americans now need the help of the Chinese to try and bring an end to the Iran war and to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. How is this playing within the MAGA constituency, which of course sees the United States of America as this big, great military power, but now it needs to rely on the Chinese to resolve a crisis?
I think it's clear that militarily the United States doesn't need China's help. It's when it wants to hit its targets, it's been successful. It's the strategic aspect of that relationship and that confrontation that ultimately China may be able to play a mediating role in, notably when it comes to the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which the United States views as being to the benefit of the Chinese themselves. According to the White House readout, what we know is that the two sides agreed that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to support the free flow of energy. President Xi made clear China's opposition to the militarization of the strait and any effort for charging toll for its use, and he expressed interest in purchasing more American oil because of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this is what the Americans are saying in the readout. The devil's in the detail ultimately, and once this trip is wrapped up, whether or not the Chinese will ultimately take that step and that mediating efforts to try to open the Strait of Hormuz and help the United States, or will they continue to sort of sit on the sidelines, or at least, have some sort of backdoor channel with Iran and possibly Russia as well to see how they can mitigate this crisis. But what's noteworthy is the two sides did talk about the strait. I think for the president, it was important that he was able to put out this statement saying that China agrees that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. Again, ultimately how far China is willing to go this path is yet to be seen. But I think it was also very noteworthy that China came out and said that the mishandling of the Taiwan conflict could ultimately become a disaster in bilateral relations. One has to wonder whether or not they sort of discussed some kind of give and take regarding Taiwan and the Strait of Hormuz. I think in the next hours and days to come, we're going to get a better understanding of that. Of course, that's very concerning for the Taiwanese.
I think that's a crucial issue that we'll be talking about. But I want you to weigh in on another very interesting thing that Xi Jinping said as a part of his address during the banquet, where he said that Chinese rejuvenation and MAGA, that is Make America Great Again, the overarching theme of Donald Trump's presidency, can actually go hand in hand without being in conflict with each other. Now, Donald Trump has praised Xi Jinping in the past, but he's also blown hot and cold in China, starting the tariff war, imposing enormous amount of tariffs on Chinese goods. And the United States, even in its security policies, views China as its great rival in the 21st century. With that being the case, can the two nations actually cooperate with each other? Because there are a lot of sectors in which China and the United States would be competing with each other. Can Donald Trump iron out these differences and keep the MAGA base happy?
Yeah, President Trump is in a very tough situation regarding that, not only because of some of the economic problems he's facing at home because of the tariffs, but also because of the fog of the Iran war. But ultimately, it appears that he is a person that respects leaders that put their country first. You see how he talks about Vladimir Putin, he talks about Xi Jinping, and I think that was reciprocal for China to sort of acknowledge MAGA, acknowledge the America's 250th birthday coming up on the 4th of July. But ultimately, we have to be clear-eyed about this, that both countries are very ideologically different in the way they see the world. And Marco Rubio said that while President Trump respects that aspect of the Chinese president, really being China first, that becomes a problem when it interferes in America's national security, which we've seen, with the spies and also with the theft of intellectual property and whatnot. So there is common ground, perhaps, to find when it comes to trade. But ultimately, I think the issue of national security weighs heavily on the United States. And they want to sort of manage this competition as opposed to really going all out and becoming partners. So it's a very delicate balance that President Trump has to really navigate right now with China, which is facing economic problems at home, which might make it more hostile towards Taiwan, sort of thinking that it's now or never. So yeah, the U.S. is in a difficult position, but I don't think either side wants to see this sort of fragile relationship that they have go south.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Susan Tehrani, for joining us from New York and getting us all those updates there. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.